Note-taking will facilitate in many ways, in very significant ways, their success in my class. They can be obviously much more engaged when they take notes because they have to follow a narrative and make sure they understand its content. They have to approach the information that I deliver critically, and then obviously they can understand its significance and apply it to further information. It's a challenge, I think, for students, and particularly freshman students, because some of them are not quite accustomed to note-taking to the degree perhaps I expect them to take notes. In my classes, they should be doing actually two kinds of note-taking. Many of our students are not accustomed to lengthy academic readings, and of course that's to be expected, particularly younger students. So they read something and they get the general gist, and they are satisfied with that, which is fine. But then when it comes to class discussion, unless they've taken detailed notes and they've tried to map, again, the agenda of their reading the same way we do in class, they are not able to flesh out the meanings. For most of my readings, they have to identify the author's thesis, they have to identify the arguments that the author makes, and then the conclusion. And there are two reasons I do that. First of all, I want them to understand that there is an internal structure to any reading. Authors do not just, particularly academic authors, do not just dump ideas in a reading and hope that you're going to decipher the sequence. They have obviously a very concrete notion of how things should develop from one concept to another. So I want them to be able to understand the sequencing, and also, again, building a skill. I want them to have a template as to how they should be doing their research and writing down the road. So I encourage them to read first without taking any notes, just underlining words perhaps that they don't know, and then look them up, because in most academic readings that can be a challenge. Large words, difficult words, sometimes foreign words, and that builds, of course, another skill, language development. And then I encourage them to do a second reading, during which they may underline major ideas, perhaps write on the margins what the ideas are. And then during the third reading, and I know this is very time consuming, I literally expect them to write down the agenda. What is the thesis? What are the arguments? What pages are they in? So they can use, of course, their time very constructively to map out content, but also style, which I think can be very, very useful in a number of other activities, and applicable for that matter.
Take notes on the reading, because the next day in class, professors are either going to ask you to tell them about it, or they're going to ask you questions about it. So even if you think that you're going to remember everything, you probably won't. So definitely jot down, even at the bare minimum, the thesis and a couple of the big points of the paragraph, main ideas of those paragraphs, so that you can easily talk about it. And oftentimes some of those readings will be on the test as well, and that's your social cultural influence on the paintings as well. So if you can bring back in some of those main points from the writings to prove your points, or to illustrate those paintings in the essays, that's a huge help.
Very often students will sit in the classroom and they will listen. And I often say in my classes, guys, you may want to take this down. Because in a class session that is an hour and a half, you may indeed be able to recall the first 10 or 15 minutes. But most of us are not able to recall lengthy information without some notes at least. In most cases, students who just listen are unable to reconstruct the framework, are unable to reconstruct its particulars, and then sadly, of course, they have some difficulty applying what was said in testing situations. And so they come into class, and any time I introduce a new topic, I give them what I call the agenda for the meeting, and it's literally a bulleted list of ideas on my PowerPoint. So students generally tend to write that list down. It's available to them before they come to class, and since it's a Moodle, of course, it's going to be available for them for the duration of the course. And I literally follow that agenda in my presentation. So ideally, what I would like students to do is to look at the bullet point and then arrange underneath, again, the sub-points that I make. And to help them do that, at various points during the session, I will stop and I will say, so what did I say about A, B, C, D? So students who take good notes should be able to glance at their notes and be able to relate. Oh yeah, that's what you said, I got that, I can see how things are connected. If they do not, then they should be asking, right? I do not see the connection, I didn't get that down. And that's why I say it's a critical thinking activity. As they take notes, they should be able to follow a narrative, but obviously understand the cohesion, understand the interaction between the various pieces of information, and then be able to apply it to what they see on the screen, apply perhaps to what we learn, and then use that information to move forward. Physical aspects of note-taking, how to do it physically. Okay, I have all these ideas, how do I put them down on paper? What I find very useful, and I think students most importantly, and that's the most significant thing I find very useful, is when they write down the agenda that I have on my PowerPoint, leave some spaces in between, so that when I elaborate on my bullets, they can go back to that space and fill in the information. Sometimes, of course, they can turn the page and continue, so that they have a very concrete idea that the agenda, the bulleted list, literally corresponds to what I'm saying for the rest of the presentation. Now, the challenge to that comes with the fact that my classes are very interactive. Most often it's up to the students to analyze some of the points, because the points depend on what they've already read. So I might have included a bullet that refers very specifically to the content of one of the journal readings. So that is their responsibility to contribute to filling in the notes. And very often, of course, I will redirect, or I will emphasize a point that comes from a reading and a student makes, or I will reword it so that they can neatly sort of fill it in their blank area. I also suggest that students leave quite a wide margin on the left side of the page. So again, they have the ability to add on ideas. They might add questions to the left side of the page.
So when I got to college, I was just taking notes for art history like I was any other class, which doesn't really work because it's not the same type of note-taking, because it's a lot more detail-oriented than the other subjects, I feel. Because if you don't understand like the time period, then you're not going to understand the art. So it is a lot of dates and understanding what was happening at the time. So it's more of a history class. And like just completely. So I had to figure out how to switch from taking notes for like a high school English class, which is just really broad notes, to being more specific with my notes. I am English and art history, those are my two majors, so I've had to kind of juggle notes for both of them, and honestly my English notes have kind of started looking like my art history notes. But with English, you'll get a broad view of a time period, or if you're taking a specific class, like 17th century literature, then, specifically notes on that. But because you're just focusing on one thing at a time, and not multiple artists or multiple authors, then there's not as much, it's not as much to write down at once, you know. But with art history, a lot of times the classes that you're taking are covering multiple periods of art and like multiple artists that you're learning about in one class, in one period. So you have to kind of evolve your notes to what's necessary, to write out exactly what's necessary for this artist. And is that comment that the professor said, is that really necessary? Did she say that like in passing? And over time I had to figure out what was really necessary and what wasn't, because a lot of the time I would just write down everything, and a lot of the time not everything that's being said or being like put up on a slide is 100% necessary to what is going to be on the test or what you actually need to know for your subject. If a framework is given, I will write down the framework at the top of my notes. For that section of my notes, then the framework is right there. And sometimes I'll go back and make sure that I have the information that the framework was talking about. And it is easier if your teacher gives you something like that, because then you can be like, okay, so we covered this, and this is where that section in my notes is, so I know I have that down. And if there's something that is in the framework that you might have missed, you can go back and ask your teacher, or go back and look through maybe a friend's notes or through your textbook to see, oh, that's what she was talking about, that's what he was talking about, and then you go back and you can put that down too. So, yeah.
We usually stick to the main topics. I'll start with, usually the professor goes over some general information at the beginning of class. So stick some bullets up at the front about the sociocultural information or the main points. And then I'll usually sort them by either artist or paintings, so the title of the paintings, and possibly the artist at the top, and then bullet under that for the painting, which I usually mark by either underlining or in quotations, and then bullets under that about what the teacher says is important, the symbols in their painting, the reasoning there, going over it, the social cultural influence it had, things like that. My notes follow the lecture as it's going on so that it lines up with the PowerPoint that they're presenting during class.
Well, these were my notes from freshman year. It was for my Women in the Arts class with Dr. Terrono. And we started off with a Linda Nochlin article, so these were my notes from the article. And eventually, I wasn't exactly sure what I needed to write down because it was my first class, so I was kind of just writing down everything. But as my classes went on, I kind of figured out how to break it down, like later in the year. You know, I was better at, my handwriting got worse, but I was better at figuring out what was 100% necessary. Things that were really, really important, I would, you know, put arrows next to, I would box them in or underline them. In some instances, I would put X's next to them. Let me see if I can find an example of that. Maybe. Oh yeah, like here. This was a really important day. So everything here, I might have done this in class, but yeah, I took all these notes in class, so I felt everything was necessary that day. But during the class, if things were, like if we went back and we retouched on a subject, I wouldn't go back and take the same notes again. I would just add more stuff to them. So the purple is what I took one day in class, and the green is what I added on later. So we were talking about Dutch artists. Yeah, we were talking about Holland that day. And I think we came back and we revisited the subject a couple times, so I just kept adding on notes to it. Yeah, so these are my notes continuing for that day. What I've kind of figured out what works for me. And I know that there are different types of taking notes, but this one works best for me, is I kind of take notes in list format, where I'll have my headings, and then I'll put down the information, and then if I need subheadings, then I'll do that too. My notes got better as I started taking more classes, but this is kind of the setup that worked best for me. So yeah, and in some instances, after we were done with the class, or after, or right before a test, I would go back through and sometimes like highlight what I thought was necessary.
All right, so I have general information at the top of the page. We were talking about Napoleon in this time. Then I'll make sure that the painting's name is in, of course, quotation marks. And then things about, of course, the artist was David. And then the points that are important to that painting. The way, of course, that there was foreshortening in that painting, which I have pointed out here, or the way that the figures look in certain areas, and then different names and inscriptions that were also in that painting as well.
It's hard to explain, but after you get used to it, like your different professors, then it's a little bit easier to do that.